The phone was hot against my ear, his voice slicing through with a sharp arrogance that made my stomach turn. "Mom, stop being so dramatic. Your daughter being in the ICU isn't my fault," David shouted, his words filled with disdain. I clenched the phone tighter, my nails digging into my palm as I forced my tone into icy calmness. "You are about to learn what being truly abandoned feels like, David." And there was a silence, broken only by the faint echo of laughter and music from the background. I could almost picture him standing under palm trees, a drink in his hand, waves crashing somewhere nearby. His world was warm, carefree, and far from the cold, sterile corridor where I stood. Behind me, the steady beeping of machines reminded me why I could not lose focus. My daughter was fighting for her life. Her body lay fragile, surrounded by wires and tubes, and inside her, the faint rhythm of her unborn child struggled to keep its own fragile promise of survival. He was living in paradise. She was clinging to life, and I was the mother who had just decided that his betrayal would cost him everything. When I stepped out of the sliding doors at JFK Airport, the chill of October wrapped around me like an old shawl. The wind carried that unmistakable scent of New York in autumn, a mixture of roasted chestnuts from a vendor cart and the faint metallic bite of the Hudson. I had not planned to come home so soon. My trip across Europe was supposed to last until Christmas, a season I thought I would spend wandering through candlelit markets in Vienna or tracing the worn cobblestones of Florence. But the whisper of intuition, the quiet tug in my chest that mothers know too well, had pulled me back earlier than expected. That instinct would soon prove to be the lifeline my daughter so desperately needed. I was 59 years old, though age had become more of a companion than an adversary. My silver hair, which I twisted neatly into a chignon each morning, was no longer a mark of fading youth but a crown earned through storms, weathered and wars survived. Once, I had been the head of a consultancy firm in Manhattan, a leader who moved through boardrooms with tailored grace, a woman who shaped futures with contracts and strategies. Now, I was a widow who had set down the weight of profit margins and quarterly earnings to rediscover the quieter corners of life. Europe had been my classroom of renewal. I had stood in cathedrals, my fingers tracing ancient stone, and felt the silence of centuries seep into me. I had tasted olives under the Tuscan sun and sipped wine on terraces overlooking valleys that seemed eternal. I thought I had been refilling an empty cup. I did not realize I was being prepared for a battle waiting at home. My daughter Sophia was 32 years old, carrying 8 months of life inside her fragile frame. She had inherited her father's kindness and my sharp eyes, though she often hid their strength behind a soft smile. She lived in Westchester, in a modest home surrounded by oaks that blazed with red and gold this time of year. It was her little sanctuary, a place where she could nurture the family she was building with David, her husband. To me, Sophia was still the girl who once clung to my hand on her first day of school, her tiny fingers trembling against mine. But she had grown into her own woman, one who insisted on independence, on standing tall without leaning too heavily on me. She said she wanted to raise her child with strength, to prove she could handle life's tempests. She never suspected that the greatest storm would come not from fate or illness, but from betrayal, sleeping beside her. David, my son-in-law, was 35. He walked into our lives with the charm of a polished stone. His words flowed like honey, smooth and golden, always promising something brighter just ahead. He was a tech entrepreneur, or so he claimed, forever talking about investments and startups as though he were building empires in the clouds. At first, I believed his ambition. He carried himself like a man who knew his path. But mothers have a way of sensing the shadows behind smiles. There was something about the way his eyes darted when finances were mentioned, the way he boasted too loudly at dinner parties, that left a faint unease in me. Sophia brushed aside my concerns. She said he was passionate, that his confidence was what made her fall in love. I kept silent then, trusting her choice. though silence would one day become the dagger that cut us all. When I returned to Westchester that October afternoon, suitcase in hand and heart alight with excitement to surprise my daughter, I found her house shrouded in unnatural stillness. The curtains were drawn, the lights dimmed, and a silence hung heavy over the rooms. I knocked once, then twice, and when no answer came, I pushed the door open. The air inside was cold, thick with neglect, as if laughter had long since abandoned those walls. A plate still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched, a faint ring of milk drying in the glass beside it. Something inside me froze. I called her name, my voice echoing through empty halls. No reply came, only the distant hum of the refrigerator. It was then the phone rang. A stranger's voice identified himself as a doctor from Lawrence Presbyterian Hospital. His tone was clipped yet sympathetic, as though he had rehearsed delivering news that broke families. Sophia had been admitted 3 days ago, unconscious. 3 days, and no one had called me, no one had stood by her side. I felt the weight of betrayal before I even heard the doctor hesitate when I asked the question that clawed its way out of me. "Where is her husband?" The pause was longer than it should have been. Then came the words that ignited a fire inside me. "We cannot reach him. We were told he is on a business trip." I rushed to the hospital, the world around me blurring into streaks of yellow taxi lights and gray sidewalks. The moment I entered the ICU, I saw my daughter lying pale and still. Her body a fragile vessel tethered by tubes and monitors. Machines breathed for her. Machines kept her baby alive, and I stood at her bedside feeling the universe tilt beneath my feet. Her hair, once a cascade of chestnut waves, lay limp against the pillow. Her lips, which once curved with joy at the simplest things, were pale and silent. Yet her hand, though cold, still felt like my little girl's when I clasped it. And inside her, beneath all that stillness, was the faint echo of another heartbeat, a fragile drum fighting to stay in rhythm with hers. As I stood there, I thought of the man who should have been holding that hand. I thought of the vows spoken in front of family and friends, promises of love in sickness and in health. Where was he now? The answer was whispered to me in fragments later that evening. A nurse had seen photos on social media. David was in Hawaii, smiling beneath palm trees with a young woman half his age. The images told a story more brutal than any words could. While my daughter lay abandoned, he was raising glasses filled with champagne, posting captions filled with lies about business success. The world he presented online was one of wealth and freedom. But the truth I saw was the face of betrayal so deep, it made the earth tremble beneath me. I returned to Sophia's side that night, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, whispering that I was there, that I would not leave. The city outside hummed with its endless rhythm. But inside that room, the world had narrowed to the fragile rise and fall of her chest. I promised her silently that no matter what it took, she would never be alone again. The betrayal of a husband could wound, but the strength of a mother would shield her. I had not built an empire, survived loss, and walked through decades of storms to falter now. That night marked the beginning. I did not yet know how deep David's deception ran, but I knew this: I would uncover it all, and he would come to understand that when a mother rises in defense of her child, no betrayal can stand unpunished. The next morning, as the pale autumn light crept through the blinds of the hospital room, I sat in a chair beside my daughter's bed, her fragile hand still resting in mine. The steady rhythm of the monitors filled the silence, a mechanical heartbeat that reminded me of how close we were to losing everything. I had not closed my eyes all night. Sleep felt impossible when the image of her husband laughing under Hawaiian skies kept intruding into my mind. I watched the nurse adjust the tubes and check the baby's heartbeat with a small device, the faint sound fluttering like wings against glass. That fragile pulse became my anchor. It was a reminder that 2 lives depended on what I chose to do next. When the doctor entered with his clipboard pressed tightly to his chest, his face carried the weight of unspoken truths. I asked again, though I already knew the answer in my bones. Where was David? Why had he not stood here, where a husband should have been, when his wife's body was trembling on the edge of collapse? The doctor hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other, before confessing that no call had been returned, no message answered. He was supposed to be away for business, yet no details had been provided. The words rang hollow, like church bells striking at midnight, with no congregation left to hear them. Business trips do not last 3 days without a single check-in, especially when your wife is carrying your child. Business trips do not leave silence in place of concern. I felt a storm building inside me, a gathering thundercloud that refused to be ignored. For years I had been told I was dramatic, too sharp, too suspicious, yet a mother's intuition rarely lies. That morning, as the machines hummed and my daughter's chest rose and fell like waves against a fragile shore, suspicion hardened into conviction. Something was very wrong, and the man who should have been her protector was nowhere to be found. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the last messages between them. Weeks of short replies from him, excuses about late meetings, vague promises of returning home soon. The words read like smoke, insubstantial and fleeting, as though designed to vanish before they could be held accountable. There was no warmth in them, no urgency, only the cold efficiency of someone maintaining appearances. My fingers trembled as I set the phone down, but my mind was steady. David was hiding something, and I intended to find out what. That afternoon, I left the hospital for the first time since my arrival. The air outside smelled of damp leaves and exhaust fumes, and the city seemed to hum with secrets. I drove back to Sophia's house in Westchester, determined to search for answers. The home that once welcomed me with warmth now felt like a mausoleum of broken promises. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching the furniture, looking for traces of the life my daughter believed she had. Bills piled neatly on the desk in the study, but the numbers told a story that was unraveling. Payments late. Credit cards stretched thin. Even the mortgage documents suggested another loan had been taken without Sophia's knowledge. My chest tightened as I pieced together the puzzle. David had spoken of success, of ventures growing, of investors eager to back him. But the truth whispered through these papers told a different tale. Bankruptcy filings from 6 months ago, notices from creditors, accounts drained to the dregs. He had been building castles of air, and when they collapsed, he had used Sophia's stability to cushion his fall. Each page was a betrayal. Each signature, a dagger driven deeper into the heart of the woman lying unconscious in a hospital bed. I sat down at the dining table, spreading the documents out like a map of treachery. My hands shook, not from weakness but from rage. Betrayal has a taste, bitter and metallic, and I could feel it coating my tongue. He had not only abandoned her when she needed him most, he had drained her, using her trust as currency for his illusions. My mind flashed back to the countless dinners when he had boasted about deals over wine, when he had spoken with the smooth confidence of a man on the rise. How easily lies can wear the mask of ambition. When evening fell, I returned to the hospital, my bag heavier with the evidence I carried. I did not share it yet, not with Sophia still unconscious, but I kept it close as though it were a weapon waiting to be drawn. That night, as the machines continued their unyielding vigil, I whispered to her that I had discovered the first cracks, that truth was seeping out, and that I would not stop until every shadow was brought into the light. The following day, I decided to confront the absence head-on. I dialed David's number, each ring echoing in the hollow space of my chest. At last he answered, his voice irritated, as if my call had interrupted something pleasurable. When I asked why he had not been by his wife's side, his reply was sharp, defensive, cruel. He told me I was being too dramatic, that her condition was not his fault, that he had other matters to attend to. His words cut like glass, not because of what he said, but because of what they revealed. There was no remorse, No sense of duty, only disdain. In that moment, with the hospital corridors stretching empty around me and the scent of antiseptic in the air, I made a vow to myself. If he would not protect her, I would. If he would not honor his vows, I would become the shield that no betrayal could pierce. The mother he underestimated would be the mother who dismantled the empire of lies he had built. The silence that once allowed him to thrive would now become the voice that exposed him. Conflict had begun, not in a courtroom or on a battlefield, but in the quiet determination of a woman sitting beside her daughter's hospital bed. I had built companies before. I had navigated ruthless negotiations, and I had faced loss so profound it nearly swallowed me. I knew the terrain of struggle, but this time the fight was personal, and that made me dangerous. As the city outside settled into another restless night, I leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on Sophia's face, pale but beautiful even in stillness. I thought of the baby inside her, the heartbeat fluttering like a candle flame in a draft. I thought of the husband who had vanished into oceans and lies. And I thought of the promise I had made the moment I heard his careless voice through the phone. He would learn what abandonment truly meant. He would learn that a mother's love, once challenged, transforms into a force more relentless than any storm. That night, as the machines sang their ceaseless chorus and the city's heartbeat throbbed beyond the hospital walls, I closed my eyes for the first time in days, not to rest, but to gather strength. For the battle had begun, and I knew that every step from here would be a step deeper into the shadows of deceit David had woven, and I was ready to tear every single thread apart until only truth remained. The days that followed blurred together, like the endless ticking of a clock that refused to move forward. Each morning I arrived at the hospital before the sun had risen, my heart clenched as I checked the fragile rise and fall of my daughter's chest. Nurses came and went, doctors updated charts, and machines hummed without rest. But beneath that routine, a storm was forming, and I was the one holding the reins. I had always believed in patience, but patience was no longer a virtue here. It was a luxury we could not afford. My daughter's life hung in the balance, and the truth about David was unraveling faster than I had anticipated. One evening, after ensuring Sophia's condition remained stable, I stepped outside to call Robert Hayes, a lawyer who had been both my colleague and friend for more than 20 years. Robert was a man whose reputation in Manhattan legal circles was carved from iron. He was tall, stern, with a voice that carried both authority and compassion, a rare blend that made him trusted in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. When he answered, I could hear the faint rustle of papers behind him, as though he was already preparing for a battle the moment he heard my voice. I told him everything about the bankruptcy notices, the drained accounts, the silence from David, and the photographs of a tropical escape that mocked my daughter's suffering. Robert listened quietly, asking only a few sharp questions before promising to dig deeper. By the time I returned to Sophia's room, he had already set his network in motion. The following morning he called me back, his words clipped with urgency. David's company had collapsed half a year ago, debt swallowing every ounce of credibility he had once boasted about. He had filed for bankruptcy quietly, shielding the truth from Sophia, weaving stories of expansion while their financial foundation crumbled beneath them. Their home had been mortgaged a second time, accounts drained, joint savings wiped clean. The picture Robert painted was not of a struggling entrepreneur, but of a gambler who had staked his wife's security for his own illusions of grandeur. I sat in the hospital cafeteria as I absorbed this, the bitter taste of coffee turning to ash on my tongue. Betrayal in marriage is a wound, but betrayal in trust, when it endangers not just a wife, but an unborn child, becomes something darker, something close to evil. As I stared at the ripples in the untouched cup before me, I realized this was no longer about negligence. This was deliberate abandonment, a choice he had made to chase pleasure while leaving devastation in his wake. Later that afternoon, Robert sent me another update. that twisted the knife deeper. David was not just in Hawaii for leisure. He was there with a young woman named Tiffany, a social media influencer whose life was displayed in curated squares of beaches, cocktails, and neon nights. Photographs on her page showed them together, his arms slung around her, his smile wide, his eyes glimmering with the kind of happiness he had long stopped showing my daughter. The captions beneath their images dripped with vanity and indulgence, their words mocking the reality of the hospital bed, where Sophia lay fighting for both herself and her child. The world might have seen a glamorous couple, but I saw a predator sinking into a fantasy while abandoning the very people who had trusted him most. That night, I stood at the window of Sophia's room, the city lights shimmering beyond the glass like distant stars. I whispered a promise into the dark. He would not get away with this. Not with the lies, not with the betrayal, not with the theft of her security and the cruelty of his absence. I had once been known in business for my calm negotiations, but I had also been known for my relentlessness when crossed. David had no idea that by abandoning my daughter, he had awakened a force far stronger than any market storm he had faced. The next step came swiftly. With Robert's guidance, I moved to freeze every account linked to David, personal, joint, or business. Within days, his credit cards declined, his funds inaccessible. It was a surgical strike, not of rage but of precision. The same way I once dismantled failing deals in my career. I could imagine him standing at a counter in some Hawaiian bar, attempting to pay for another round of drinks, only to be told his card had no balance. I pictured his confusion, his rising panic as he realized the financial foundation he had taken for granted was dissolving beneath him. That vision did not bring me joy, but it brought me resolve. Late one evening, my phone buzzed with his number. When I answered, his voice was sharp, frantic, the arrogance stripped away by desperation. He demanded to know why his accounts were frozen, why every card he swiped failed. I listened, my silence a weight on the line. Finally, I spoke, each word calm and measured, as though I were negotiating the most important contract of my life. I told him that he wanted freedom, and now he had it. Freedom without my daughter's money, without her sacrifices, without her loyalty to shield him. The line went quiet for a long moment before he erupted into curses, but I ended the call with a steady hand. It was the first time I had truly felt control returning to me, and I knew it was only the beginning. I returned to Sophia's side after the call, the machines still keeping their tireless vigil. I whispered to her what I had done, even though she could not yet hear me. I told her that justice had begun, that he was tasting the emptiness he had tried to leave us with. And though her eyes remained closed, I imagined that somewhere in her unconscious state, she could sense the tide turning. Conflict was no longer just suspicion. It had transformed into action, into steps that would ripple outward until every secret was revealed. I did not know how much more pain lay ahead, but I knew one truth with absolute clarity. David had underestimated not only a wife's endurance, but a mother's resolve. And soon, he would learn that storms do not ask for permission before they break. They simply arrive, sweeping away everything that cannot withstand their fury. The following week stretched like a taut string ready to snap. While Sophia remained in her fragile slumber, the truth around David began to spill into daylight, like ink spreading across paper. Each revelation Robert uncovered felt heavier than the last. There were shell companies registered in his name, businesses that existed only on paper but served as funnels for borrowed money. He had promised investors golden returns, yet behind those glittering promises lay nothing but smoke and mirrors. Lawsuits were already gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, and whispers among his former associates spoke of betrayal even in professional circles. It was as though his entire life was built upon sand, and now the tide had come rushing in to claim it. Robert and I met one afternoon in his midtown office, a space lined with shelves of heavy law books that smelled faintly of leather and time. He laid the documents out before me like a battlefield map. Every line of fine print, another bullet wound against the illusion David had carefully constructed. I studied them with the same focus I once gave to corporate contracts, my eyes following numbers, dates, signatures, each one confirming what I already knew in my heart. He had not simply failed, he had deceived, stolen, and abandoned, leaving behind a trail of ruin. Yet what struck me most was not the financial destruction, but the audacity of his facade. Even as debts mounted, even as investors withdrew, he smiled for photographs on tropical beaches, projecting triumph while concealing collapse. That dissonance was a cruelty I could not forgive. As the weight of these discoveries pressed down on me, I turned my attention to Sophia's well-being. Each evening I sat beside her, speaking softly, telling her the truth piece by piece, even though she could not yet respond. I wanted her to know, even in dreams, that the illusions surrounding her were being torn away, that her mother was fighting for her in ways both seen and unseen. The nurses often glanced at me with pity, perhaps wondering why I spoke so fervently to someone unconscious, but I knew that love does not require ears to be heard. It seeps into the soul, through presence alone. One night as I left the hospital, the city's wind cut against my face, carrying with it the smell of rain and the faint sound of a saxophone drifting from a street corner. I thought of David in Hawaii, his laughter spilling into the night air beside that young woman, whose world revolved around followers and flashing cameras. I imagined the moment his card was declined, the mask slipping from his face, panic setting in. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing that his comfort was crumbling, but I also felt a deeper resolve settle into me. This was no longer about revenge. It was about reclamation of dignity, of security, of truth. My daughter's life would not be remembered as a cautionary tale of betrayal, but as a testimony to resilience. The first real crack appeared when David called again, this time not with anger but with a desperate attempt at charm. His voice dripped with the same honeyed cadence he had once used to win Sophia, asking me to unfreeze the accounts, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. He promised to fly back, to stand by her side, to make amends if only I released the funds. His words might have swayed a weaker heart, but to me they were empty vessels, hollow promises echoing in a chamber I had long since locked. I told him that actions carry weight heavier than words, that his silence during those 3 days had spoken louder than any apology could. He tried to laugh it off, to downplay the gravity, but his nervous tremor betrayed him. Before he could weave another lie, I ended the call, feeling a calm power radiate through me like steady fire. The news of his affair spread quickly once Robert discreetly fed information to a journalist he trusted. Within days, an article appeared in Social Eye magazine, exposing not just the financial scandal, but the photographs of him entwined with Tiffany while his pregnant wife lay hospitalized. The headline burned across screens: "Tech mogul abandons pregnant wife for social media mistress." The story went viral, shared endlessly, each comment another nail sealing his social coffin. Investors who once shook his hand now turned away. Business partners who once praised his vision now denounced him. Tiffany, the woman who had basked in his borrowed glow, vanished from his side the moment the money dried, leaving him to face the wreckage alone. I watched from a quiet distance, not gloating but steadfast. Justice was unfolding, not in dramatic explosions, but in steady unraveling, thread by thread, until the tapestry of deceit was nothing but scraps on the floor. Yet even as the world condemned him, I remained focused on the hospital room, where the real battle was being fought. My daughter's breath, shallow but steady, was worth more than any public scandal. My grandchild's fragile heartbeat was the only rhythm that mattered. Still, there was one confrontation that remained unfinished. I knew that eventually he would have to face me, not through phone lines or magazine articles, but face to face, where no charm could shield him. I envisioned the day, the room, the silence that would fall before I spoke. I had prepared battles in boardrooms before, but this would be different. This was not about contracts or profit margins. It was about dignity, truth, and the unbreakable bond between mother and child. He had underestimated me for too long, mistaking grace for weakness, silence for compliance. Soon he would see that behind the quiet exterior burned a storm, one that could strip him of every illusion he had built. As I returned to the hospital late one evening, I paused outside the door of Sophia's room, my hand resting on the cool metal handle. The machines inside hummed like a fragile orchestra playing a symphony of survival. I whispered once more to the child growing within her, a vow carried on the quiet hum of the city beyond. You will be born into a world where truth stands taller than lies, where strength outlasts betrayal, where a mother's love builds walls no storm can breach. That promise was not just for the baby, but for Sophia, for myself, and for every woman who had ever been told to stay silent in the face of abandonment. The conflict had escalated beyond whispers and suspicions. It had become a fire consuming the falsehoods David had spun. And though flames are dangerous, they also illuminate. With each passing day, the light grew brighter, and I was ready for the next step, the confrontation that would end not with anger alone, but with undeniable truth spoken aloud where he could not escape. The turning point came quietly, not with a rush of trumpets or flashing headlines, but with the slow flutter of eyelids in a room that had known only silence for far too long. It was early morning, the kind of dawn when the sky blushes with pale rose, and the air feels tender, as though the world itself is holding its breath. I had spent the night once again by Sophia's side, my hand resting over hers, my eyes heavy yet unwilling to close. The monitors ticked faithfully, each beep a fragile promise, and then, as though responding to some unspoken prayer, she stirred. At first, it was only the faintest movement, the flutter of her fingers beneath mine, but then her lips parted, and a whisper escaped, thin as thread, yet stronger than any storm. David left. The words cracked something inside me, not because they were a revelation, but because of the pain woven into them. She did not ask where he was, nor did she try to excuse him. Her first thought upon returning from that abyss was acknowledgement of abandonment. I felt my throat tighten, tears threatening to break free, but I swallowed them down, leaning closer to stroke her hair. I told her she was safe now, that I was here, that she did not need to carry this burden alone. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, met mine with a steadiness that startled me. In that gaze I saw not only sorrow but also a rising flame, a determination I had not expected so soon. She whispered again, her voice trembling but resolute. I want to be part of what you are planning. I froze, not because I doubted her strength, but because I had promised myself to shield her from further pain. Yet as I looked into her weary face, I realized that to exclude her would be to deny her agency, to treat her as fragile glass, when in truth she was forged from the same fire that had carried me through loss and survival. 2 generations of women, one seasoned by years and one wounded yet unbroken, were about to rise together. The betrayal that sought to silence her had instead awakened a force stronger than David could have imagined. Over the next few days, Sophia's strength returned in small yet steady increments. Her voice grew firmer, her questions sharper, her eyes brighter each time we spoke about what had been uncovered. I told her about the bankruptcy, the drained accounts, the photographs of his affair. Each revelation was a wound, but she bore them with quiet dignity, nodding slowly, her lips pressing together in a line that spoke of resolve. She no longer wept. Instead, she listened with the calm intensity of a woman who had seen the worst and chosen to fight rather than collapse. At night, when exhaustion weighed heavily on her, I would sit close and tell her stories of her childhood, of the times she had fallen but risen stronger, of the resilience that was written into her very being. I wanted her to remember that this strength was not new. It had always been there, waiting for this moment to be summoned. One evening, as the city lights flickered awake, she turned to me with a look that reminded me of her father's steady courage. "I do not want him to get away with this," she said softly, each word deliberate. "Not just for me, but for our child. He should know that some betrayals cannot be hidden behind charm or excuses." Her words were both plea and declaration, and in that moment, I knew the turning point had fully arrived. No longer was this only my battle, it was ours. Robert visited us in the hospital a few days later, bringing not just legal documents, but also a quiet respect for Sophia's presence at the table. He explained the legal options, the steps we had already taken, and those that lay ahead. Sophia listened carefully, her hands folded over her stomach, the weight of impending motherhood making her posture both protective and regal. She asked questions that startled even Robert, probing for details, refusing to let any ambiguity linger. Watching her, I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride because she was stepping into her strength with grace. Sorrow because she should not have had to learn such lessons in the shadow of betrayal. Yet life does not always grant us gentle teachers. Sometimes, the harshest storms reveal our truest selves. As word of David's downfall spread through his professional circles, the phone began to ring with calls from former associates seeking distance. Some expressed outrage, others thinly veiled schadenfreude, but all carried the same message. His empire had crumbled, and they wanted no part of the ruins. Sophia listened quietly to one such conversation, her face unreadable. When I hung up, she said simply, "He built his life on lies, and now he has to live in their ashes." Her tone was not vindictive, merely factual, as though she were observing the inevitable consequence of arrogance. There was a moment one evening when she asked me to place her hand on her stomach. We sat together in the hospital room, the machines humming their ceaseless vigil, and she whispered to the child within her, telling them that they were loved, that they would grow up surrounded by truth, not deception. I watched her lips curve into a small, tender smile, and I realized then that the turning point was not only about confronting David, it was about reclaiming hope, about ensuring that the next generation would not be tainted by the shadows of this betrayal. That resolve gave her strength, and in turn, it gave me strength as well. David attempted one final maneuver during this time. He sent an email filled with apologies, claiming he had made mistakes, that he wanted to return, that he still loved her. The words were ornate, almost theatrical, dripping with sentiment meant to mask desperation. Sophia read it in silence, her face calm. When she finished, she handed me the phone and said, "Delete it." I hesitated, surprised by her decisiveness, but she repeated, "Delete it. I do not want his words in my space anymore." And so I did, with a final tap that felt like closing a door forever. The turning point was complete. No longer were we haunted by questions of why or how. We had moved into the realm of what next. Sophia was no longer a passive victim lying in a hospital bed. She was a woman reclaiming her voice, her dignity, her future. And I, standing beside her, felt the bond between us deepen into something unbreakable. Mother and daughter, scarred yet unyielding, ready to face the storm together. The weeks that followed felt like the tightening of a bowstring, every step drawing us closer to the moment when the arrow would finally be released. With Sophia gaining strength each day, and her child's heartbeat steady and strong, we shifted from defense to offense. Robert became our constant ally, guiding us through the labyrinth of legal strategy, while I stood beside my daughter as she learned to transform her pain into power. Together, we turned betrayal into fuel, each revelation sharpening our resolve. David had believed his lies would remain hidden, but truth has a way of rising, and once it does, it spreads like fire through dry grass. The financial strike was the first blow, and it was as precise as the scalpel that saved lives in the rooms around us. Robert filed motions that froze every remaining asset in David's name. Hidden accounts tucked away in the shadows of foreign banks were traced and locked. Business ventures halted mid-step. Investors alerted to the fraud that had seeped into their dealings. One by one, the pillars of his fabricated empire toppled, leaving him standing in the rubble of debts and lawsuits. I imagined him staring at the cold reality of bank statements reduced to zero, the once endless stream of money now nothing more than a dry riverbed. For years he had spoken of building legacies, yet all that remained was a wasteland of his own making. Sophia insisted on being present for each meeting, her voice calm yet unwavering as she signed documents and asked questions. She wanted to understand, to reclaim ownership of her life in every way possible. Watching her reminded me of my own younger self, navigating boardrooms filled with men who underestimated me. I had learned then that quiet persistence often speaks louder than anger, and now I saw that same strength mirrored in her. David had abandoned her, but she would not abandon herself. Each pen stroke was not just a legal act, it was a declaration that she refused to be defined by betrayal. The second strike came through the media, swift and merciless. Robert had cultivated connections for years, and when the journalist from Social Eye published the exposé, it spread like wildfire across every corner of the digital world. Photographs of David and Tiffany lounging in luxury, while Sophia lay in a hospital bed, filled the screens of strangers everywhere. Headlines screamed betrayal, the contrast so stark that sympathy poured in for my daughter like a river after drought. People who had never met her felt outrage on her behalf, their voices rising in unison across platforms, condemning the man who had abandoned both wife and unborn child. It was not vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was truth, displayed without filter. And truth has a way of making even the most polished masks crumble. As the article gained momentum, investors who once shook his hand now turned their backs. Lawsuits multiplied, creditors demanded payment, and the glamorous life he had flaunted became a hollow echo. Tiffany, the young woman who had posed by his side with drinks in hand and laughter on her lips, disappeared once the reality of bankruptcy settled in. Without money to gild the illusion, David was left alone, his social circle evaporating like mist under sunlight. The same friends who once toasted his success now whispered his name with disdain, eager to distance themselves from the wreckage. Sophia read the article only once, her expression steady as she scrolled through the words. Then she set the phone down and said simply, "Let the world see who he really is." The third strike was social exile, and it was perhaps the most devastating of all. Money can be regained, reputations sometimes rebuilt, but exile from trust and belonging cuts deeper than financial loss. David soon found that no investor would return his calls, no partner would stand beside him, no friend would risk association. The man who once strutted through rooms with the swagger of ambition was now reduced to silence, his name spoken only in cautionary tales. It was not me who condemned him, nor Sophia, nor even Robert. It was the collective judgment of a world that had glimpsed the truth and refused to forget. Throughout all of this, Sophia grew stronger not only in body but in spirit. She walked the halls of the hospital with me, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her steps deliberate and unhurried. She spoke with nurses and thanked them, smiled at strangers, and carried herself with a dignity that made me ache with pride. Betrayal had wounded her, yes, but it had not defined her. Instead, it had become the forge in which her resilience was tempered. One night, as we sat together, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky, she turned to me and said, "I feel lighter now, as though every lie he built is no longer pressing down on me." Her words were soft, but they rang with the clarity of a bell. David's voice appeared again one evening, desperate through the phone, a shadow of the arrogance he once wielded. He pleaded for understanding, for forgiveness, for another chance. His words spilled out like broken glass, sharp yet empty, and I listened with the calm patience of someone who had already heard enough. When I handed the phone to Sophia, she held it for a long moment before speaking. Her words were steady, not cruel, but final. You left me when I needed you most. You left our child before they even entered this world. There is no coming back from that. She ended the call without waiting for his reply, her hand trembling only for a moment before she placed it firmly over her stomach again. That night, as I sat in the chair by her bed, I thought of all the years I had spent navigating challenges in business, of the countless decisions that shaped lives and futures, yet none compared to this. Here, in this battle for dignity and truth, I was not just a strategist or a negotiator. I was a mother, and the stakes were not profit or loss, but the legacy of love and resilience passed down to a daughter and soon to a grandchild. The climax was approaching, and I knew that the final showdown would not be waged through documents or headlines alone. It would come when David was forced to sit before us, stripped of charm and lies, confronted by the very people he had betrayed. And when that moment came, I would be ready to look him in the eye and show him the cost of underestimating the strength of a mother's love. The day of the confrontation arrived beneath a sky, heavy with gray clouds, as though even the heavens understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Robert had arranged for the meeting to take place in his Manhattan office, a space where walls of glass overlooked the city that never slept. I sat beside Sophia, who carried herself with quiet strength, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She wore a simple dress, the color of ivory, her hair pulled back, her face pale yet resolute. To see her seated upright, no longer tethered to machines, filled me with a pride deeper than any I had known. Across the polished oak table lay a stack of documents, evidence of betrayal waiting to be spoken aloud. When the door opened and David entered, silence cloaked the room. Gone was the swagger, the polished confidence he once wore like a crown. His suit hung loosely, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, his hands twitching as though unable to decide whether to reach for charm or defense. He glanced at Sophia, then at me, his mouth opening only to close again when no words came. For the first time, he seemed small, a man stripped of the illusions he had built so carefully. Robert began the proceedings with measured calm, his voice a steady current guiding us through the storm. One by one, he laid out the facts. The bankruptcy hidden for half a year, the drained accounts, the second mortgage signed without consent, the photographs of paradise enjoyed at another's side, while Sophia lay in an ICU bed. Each fact was a stone, and together they built a wall of truth impossible to scale. David tried to interrupt, his voice rising with desperate excuses, but Robert silenced him with nothing more than a raised hand and a firm tone. Finally, it was my turn. I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto his, and for a moment the years fell away. I saw the man who had once charmed my daughter, who had smiled across our dinner table, who had spoken of building futures. But I also saw the man who had abandoned her, who had drained her trust and left her gasping for life while he toasted under tropical skies. My voice, when it came, was low but clear, each word carrying the weight of nights spent in hospital corridors. I told him of the silence during those 3 days, of the loneliness that pressed upon my daughter like a stone while he laughed beside someone else. I told him that betrayal is not just leaving a woman, it is leaving the child she carried, the family she trusted him to protect. And I told him that there would be no forgiveness, no return, only consequences. Sophia then spoke, her voice trembling at first, but steadying with every sentence. She did not shout, nor did she cry. Instead, she laid bare the truth of her heart with a calm that pierced sharper than any scream. She told him that she had loved him once, that she had believed in his dreams, but that love cannot survive abandonment. She told him that the moment he chose to dance in the glow of another's laughter while she lay unconscious was the moment he severed every bond they had shared. "You will not know this, child," she said, her hand pressing gently against her stomach. "You gave up that right when you walked away. You chose freedom, and now you will live with it, alone." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. David's eyes darted from face to face, searching for sympathy, for any crack through which he could slip his charm, but there was none. Even Robert, whose professionalism was unshakable, looked at him with something close to disdain. When David finally spoke, his words stumbled over one another, a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative. He claimed he had been under pressure, that he had intended to return, that the affair was a mistake born of weakness. But excuses cannot erase truth, and lies sound thin when spoken in a room already heavy with evidence. His voice faltered, his shoulders slumped, and in that moment, I saw the collapse, not of a businessman, but of a man who had gambled everything and lost. I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. What I felt was closure, a sealing of the wound that had bled for too long. Betrayal had tried to define us, but here in this room, truth reclaimed its throne. Sophia sat taller, her face calm, her eyes unflinching. She did not need to say more. Her silence spoke louder than his babbled excuses. Robert concluded the meeting with the legal consequences awaiting him. Charges for fraud, divorce proceedings that would strip him of assets, custody arrangements that would ensure he had no rights to the child he had abandoned. Each sentence landed like a gavel, final and indisputable. David's face drained of color, his hands clenching until his knuckles whitened, but he did not argue further. He knew the battle was lost. When we left the office, the sky outside had begun to clear. The gray clouds parted to reveal slivers of blue, as though the world itself acknowledged the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sophia leaned into me, her steps careful but strong, and whispered, "It is over now." I held her close, my arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks I felt a sense of peace settle deep within me. The showdown had not been a dramatic explosion of anger, but a steady unveiling of truth. And truth, once revealed, has a power greater than any lie. David had lost not only wealth and reputation, but the family he had forsaken, the legacy he had tried to counterfeit. And we, mother and daughter, walked away not as victims but as survivors, carrying with us the knowledge that storms can strip away illusions, but they also reveal the strength of the foundation beneath. After the confrontation, the days began to flow with a softer rhythm, as though the universe had finally decided to loosen the grip it had held upon us. For weeks we had lived beneath a sky, heavy with storms, yet now the clouds scattered and light filtered through. Sophia returned to my penthouse in Manhattan, the one place where I could surround her with the care she needed and shield her from the shadows of the past. The apartment, perched high above the restless city, had once felt cavernous and lonely, each polished surface reflecting my solitude. Now, as she settled into the space, it became something new, a sanctuary pulsing with the quiet strength of two women rebuilding a life together. Each morning I prepared breakfast, simple meals that filled the air with comforting aromas of toasted bread and fresh fruit. Sophia would join me at the table, moving slowly but with increasing steadiness, her hands always resting gently upon her stomach. There were moments when silence stretched between us, but it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of healing, the kind that allows wounds to close and strength to seep back into weary bones. From the windows, we watched the city awaken, taxis streaming like veins of gold across the streets, the hum of life returning with every sunrise. For the first time in months, I saw color returning to my daughter's face and hope flickering in her eyes. In the evenings we would talk, sometimes about the past, often about the future. Sophia spoke of her dreams for the child, of wanting to raise them with honesty, kindness, and resilience. She told me she wanted to create a home filled with laughter that did not hide secrets, with walls that held warmth rather than pretense. I listened, my heart swelling with both pride and tenderness, knowing that her vision was already taking shape in the way she carried herself. She was no longer defined by the betrayal she had endured. She was a woman stepping into motherhood with a courage sharpened by fire. The legal battles continued in the background, but they no longer weighed heavily upon us. Robert handled the intricacies with the precision of a surgeon, ensuring that every thread of deceit was cut clean. David was left with nothing, no home, no allies, no assets, and soon, no claim to fatherhood. Each update Robert delivered confirmed the unraveling of what had once seemed like an untouchable facade. Yet within me, there was no thirst for further punishment. Justice had been served, not by vengeance, but by truth. And truth, when allowed to stand unchallenged, is often the most devastating consequence of all. One evening, as the city's lights shimmered like a sea of stars, Sophia and I stood together on the balcony. The wind carried the scent of autumn, crisp and sharp, mingling with the distant sound of laughter rising from the streets below. She leaned against the railing, her hand guiding mine to her stomach, where the child moved with a gentle kick. Tears welled in my eyes as I felt that small yet undeniable life pressing forward. "They are strong," she whispered, smiling through her weariness. "Just like us." In that moment, I realized that resilience was not something passed down through words but through presence, through the silent assurance that no storm could erase love. When the day of birth finally arrived, it unfolded beneath the pale glow of hospital lights. The hours stretched long, filled with the cries of effort and the encouragement of nurses who guided Sophia through each wave of pain. I held her hand, whispering words of comfort, though my heart raced with both fear and anticipation. Then, at last, the room filled with the sound of a newborn's cry, raw and beautiful, a melody that swept away every trace of sorrow. The baby was placed gently into Sophia's arms, their tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers. I watched as tears streamed down her cheeks, her face radiant with a joy that eclipsed all that had come before. I stood beside them, unable to hold back my own tears. In that fragile bundle of life lay not just the future, but the culmination of every battle we had fought. The child represented not only survival but renewal, proof that love, when fiercely protected, can triumph even against betrayal. Sophia looked up at me, her voice trembling yet filled with certainty. "We are going to be all right, Mom." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat too tight with emotion. In that moment, I knew she was right. The weeks after the birth were filled with sleepless nights, gentle lullabies, and the tender chaos that accompanies new life. Our days revolved around the baby's rhythms, yet there was a peace woven through the exhaustion. Each time I cradled that small being against my chest, I felt the threads of generations weaving together, binding past and future into a tapestry of resilience. Sophia glowed with the quiet strength of a new mother, her every gesture infused with love. And I, though older and wearied by loss, found myself renewed in ways I had not thought possible. The baby's cries, the soft coos, the delicate grip of their hand around my finger, these were the sounds and sensations that reminded me why we had fought so fiercely. As winter settled over the city, snowflakes drifting like feathers against the skyline, our home remained warm with light and laughter. The pain of betrayal no longer lingered as a shadow, but as a lesson etched into memory. David had vanished from our lives, his name spoken only when legal documents required it, his presence reduced to a cautionary tale. He had chosen freedom, yet what he gained was emptiness. We, in contrast, had chosen truth, and what we gained was each other. On quiet nights, I often sat by the window, holding my grandchild while the city pulsed with endless energy below. I would rock them gently, whispering stories of strength, of the storms their mother and grandmother had weathered, of the love that would always surround them. Their eyes, wide and unknowing, would blink up at me as though absorbing every word, every promise. In those moments, I felt something I had not felt in years: completion. Not because life was perfect, but because love had endured. Resolution is not about erasing scars. It is about wearing them with pride, as proof that we endured and rose stronger. Sophia and I bore those scars together, yet we also bore the light that came after. Our family, though reshaped, stood firm on foundations of truth. And as I watched my daughter cradle her child, her face illuminated by both fatigue and joy, I knew with certainty that no betrayal could ever destroy what had been rebuilt in love. When I look back on everything we endured, I realize that betrayal, as devastating as it is, does not have the final word. Pain may leave scars, but scars remind us that we survived, that we kept walking even when the road was broken beneath our feet. My daughter and I were tested in ways we never imagined. She faced abandonment in her most vulnerable moment, and I faced the anguish of watching her suffer. Yet through it all, we discovered a truth deeper than loss. The strength of love cannot be silenced, and the bond between mother and child can withstand storms that would shatter empires. If there is one lesson I wish to share, it is this: do not mistake grace for weakness. Too often, the quiet, steady ones are dismissed as fragile, but within them lies a power that awakens when loved ones are threatened. We do not always choose the battles that come to us, but we can choose how to rise from them. And rising does not always mean roaring with anger. Sometimes it means standing still with dignity while the lies of others collapse under their own weight. That is what my daughter did, and that is what I chose to do. For anyone listening who has felt abandoned, remember that your value is not diminished by someone else's failure to see it. You are not defined by the betrayal you endured, but by the courage with which you rebuild. Healing is not about erasing the past, but about transforming it into a foundation for strength. My grandchild was born into a world where truth triumphed over deception, and that is the legacy I wish to pass forward. That storms will come, but love, when fiercely protected, can outlast them all. So if you are facing silence where there should be support, if you are carrying wounds that still ache, know that you are not alone. You hold more resilience than you realize, and the very pain that sought to break you can become the force that shapes you into something unshakable. That is the gift of survival, the hidden blessing in hardship. And if this story has touched you, if you believe in the power of truth and the strength of mothers who refuse to be silent, I invite you to join me by subscribing to this channel. Share it with those who need a reminder that storms can be endured and that love, in the end, is always stronger than betrayal. Together we can keep telling stories that heal, stories that empower, stories that remind us all of the light waiting beyond the darkest night.